So now that we've been welcomed to country and we've heard from some key partners, it's time to begin the conversation with our first session. David Bowser will be our facilitator. David has more than 20 years' experience in higher education, both as an academic and leading strategy consultant. In 2016, he co-created the Curio Group, a collective of advisors, educators and product developers focused on working directly with education institutions to make a difference. Please welcome David. Take this away from you. You can, if you want to grab a seat there.
Where do you want to go?
Yeah, down here, and then your panel can join you.
Love to. All right, we've got a great panel this morning to get us kick-started. As David said, I'm also David, just to make life easier for us all this morning. Thank you. I've also got a microphone, which is very exciting. This morning we're going to cover, and actually after lunch, cover a few different sessions. We're going to be talking about really universities largely. So basically my background, which was as an academic many moons ago, it feels to me, but was part of my background. We're then going to be talking a little bit more about how they connect with each other. We're going to have a conversation with Pascal from Swinburne University as well, where we're going to try and broaden out what we've been having a conversation about. It'll be more around how do we create universities as that platform in the future. And then we're going to talk to some really interesting EdTechs. Those have been actually around the sector for some time. So with RMIT Online and OES, Online Education Services, to really understand some of the work that they're doing in the sector as well. So I'll welcome up our panel to get us started. We've got Stephen Parker and Liz Johnson, who have probably been mic'd up, but I haven't been, so I'm on the roving microphone, which I think is now on. Good morning, Stephen.
Okay.
Good to see you.
And you.
As well. Hi, Liz.
Good morning, David.
Take a seat. Isn't it nice to actually be here in person? It feels so weird in sort of a strange way. And as much as we've got the cameras, we've got the people there at home, and I was wondering if David was actually going to say, and if you need a coffee at home, you can go to your kitchen, or if you need the bathroom, well, I don't know where your bathroom is, but if we're going to try and actually open it up a little bit more. But welcome as well to the online audience also. So we're going to have a bit of a yarn about all sorts of interesting things about universities as a platform and as universities as the great connectors. Are they really the great connectors? Or have they actually been sort of holding us back in some way? But let's hear and get kick-started with Liz.
Thanks, David. I've just checked that the sound's good. Because,
yep.
Yeah. It was an interesting provocation, universities as the great connectors. Universities are, of course, interesting educators because they are required to do both research and education. That's what an Australian university is. So you'd think that they were quite good at connecting disparate fields. Perhaps that's a debatable point, as you've said, David. But it's certainly a goal. The idea of a university as an ideas exchange, an ideas hub, which translates ideas, builds ideas, and then translates them into industry, into the world of commerce, and then also into the growing workforce, is a really important connection for universities to make. And universities in Australia were founded on the idea of building the professions. That's what, if you look at the founding documents for University of Sydney and University of Melbourne, that's what they talk about. They talk about building the professions for the new country. Not so new, really. It was here 60,000 years before we arrived. But it's an interesting thing to remember. Universities were built to connect research, teaching, and society. Whether they do that or not, I think, is a more open question. It's easy to get buried in the separate missions, and it takes a conscious effort to bring the two pieces together. But I think with goodwill and a incredibly focused approach on making sure that universities are porous, that we invite people in, we can be a lot closer to that nirvana.
Wow, thanks, Liz. Nice way of setting it particularly up. Stephen, if you haven't met Stephen before, he's a former Dean, DVC and Vice Chancellor at the University of Canberra. I think I first met you back in Monash, like a long time ago now, it feels like. He was also formerly at KPMG, where he was the education sector lead and partner there, is that correct? As well. Stephen, if you haven't met Stephen or heard Stephen speak before, he's a fantastic provocateur. So, Stephen, set ourselves up. Let's talk about universities. Are they the great connectors?
All right, thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. There is said to be a gravestone in a Wild West cemetery, which reads, "First I wasn't, then I was, and now I ain't again." And so I thought I'd take this masterful summary of the life cycle to structure some comments around universities. Well, first, they wasn't. From the original universities through to the 1800s, they had some importance with some elites. They advanced to civilization, but they were largely removed from society and the economy. And there's a fascinating book by a US historian called Chad Wellman called Organizing Enlightenment, which shows how during the 1700s universities were painfully irrelevant. All the great discoveries were happening somewhere else by individual scientists. There were learned academies being started, there were journals being established, and these societies were vibrant and disputatious and heterodox, and universities were painfully traditional and orthodox. It was the establishment of the University of Berlin in 1810 with a few precursors that really modernized a sense of teaching, what a teacher was to do, which talked about research and the idea of bringing research and teaching together. And this idea really took hold in Europe and the US. And so, for example, Johns Hopkins University was founded in 1876, specifically on the University of Berlin model. So, first, universities wasn't great connectors. Then they was. Throughout the 1900s, universities were central to progress and growth. They connected social classes. They helped reduce inequality. They innovated with industry and produced graduates who themselves advanced civilization. They did amazing things. The discovery of DNA and then later what was initially called genetic fingerprinting. They didn't have a monopoly on discovery. And in some parts of the world, there are independent or separate research institutes as well. So the World Wide Web didn't come out of university, it came out of CERN. But with university graduates, and universities were there or thereabouts in everything that mattered. But now the question is whether they ain't again. So last month, the artificial intelligence lab DeepMind, owned by Alphabet, generated some incredible findings. You may know DeepMind as which developed the AlphaGo algorithm. Well, they have now uncovered the structure of almost every protein known to science. A Nobel Prize-winning chemist has said that this solves a 50-year-old grand challenge in biology and will fundamentally change biological research. Before this new system, AlphaFold as it's called, scientists knew the structure of about 180,000 proteins. They now know 200 million, courtesy of AlphaFold. And this, of course, extraordinary development happened outside a university. So in discussion, I'll say more, but in this opening salvo of the session, I'm just asserting the claim that universities are flirting now with irrelevance in the way that they were irrelevant during an age of progress in the 1700s. AI, particularly machine learning, will generate pictures of the world and explanations of it, which are quite at odds with the way that academic disciplines describe and explain it. We're on the cusp of a Copernican revolution in our understanding of the world. Now, David, I know you're a cultured man. You may not know that Pablo Picasso was once burgled, and he saw the burglars. And he offered to draw a picture of the burglars for the police, who immediately went out and arrested a horse and 2 sardines. Now, obviously, Picasso was seeing them in that way. I raised the provocation that perhaps universities are seeing the world through their lenses of disciplines and so on, but what they're seeing is a horse and two sardines. And we're about to have completely different ways of viewing the world, letting the data speak for itself. So in my opening comments, I'd say first they wasn't great connectors, then they was, but now they're in real danger of not being again.
Wow, so there you are. Provocation set. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Liz, as well. And the whole protein thing, my background actually was a long time ago around protein crystallography, and I worked with a fellow who got the Nobel Prize for working out the structure of hemoglobin. So it's basically the protein that sits in your red blood cells. It took him, I think it was 15 years to get to the point where he actually understood the structure of hemoglobin. And how long did it take these guys?
I don't know how long they did it, but pretty
amazing,
quickly, I think.
Really.
Oh,
and the complexity is amazing in proteins to be able to see, because each individual amino acid can fold in a different way and connect to another one in a completely different way. So you get hundreds of thousands of combinations. It's really quite an interesting space. But then, where are we going then with all of this technology and what's happening in the space? Is there a future for universities as great connectors, or are they a platform, perhaps? A platform for people to learn, for academics to come together? Is technology just sort of an enabler of what the experience is? But really different ways of learning, different ways of doing research could be really quite different. Stephen, you've spoken a little bit about the universities as a platform.
Yeah, do you mind if I...
Keep going.
So 7 of the world's 10 largest companies by market capitalisation are what we would now call platform businesses. The idea of a platform business isn't at all new. So barristers' chambers are actually places where solo professionals gathered together and applied their trade. And because a barrister wouldn't know one end of an invoice from the other, they had a clerk that would do the business side and so on. Marketplaces with stalls are platform businesses and so on. But of course, it's technology which has enabled people to reach markets at scale that has made such a difference. And so the question arises, well, can we have universities as platforms? And I don't mean sort of accidentally and painful platforms like engaging a lot of casual teachers, that kind of thing. I mean an organisation deliberately set up so that academics and researchers can ply their trade, can profess their profession through a particular structure. And one reason why this might be really important is what is often known as Baumol's cost disease. And the theory is that there are some sectors which have limits to how they can improve their productivity. And yet they have to compete with other sectors that can improve their productivity because they've got to offer salaries that will attract talent and so on. And education is classically a sector which suffers from Baumol's cost disease. Now, it doesn't matter for so long as people are prepared to pay for it. So if universities or education becomes more and more expensive and governments and people are happy to pay for that, then so be it. But as soon as the appetite for paying for it, or paying for the increases, starts to limit, then you get into real problems. I think universities have reached that point. I think governments have lost the appetite to increase funding. I think students have lost the capacity to increase debt or upfront payment. And I think now we've really got the crunch coming. That's the real disruptor, I suspect, of universities. Just that costs go up, but revenues don't. So that's why the platform idea, courtesy of technology, starts to become really interesting. That if it is possible to reach far more people, to do far more research, to organise oneself far more efficiently, that's the way of getting the productivity that typically has been held back in the education sector. There'll be people here that know far more about this than me, but if you followed the travails of Woolf University in the UK, there's an idea coming out basically of Oxford IT academics, and they wanted to kind of replicate the Oxbridge model, but they wanted to do it at scale through technology, so allowing 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 tutorials around the world. That floundered, but it's been reinvented as a platform software for colleges. So colleges can now go onto this platform, accredited by European accrediting bodies, and start to offer their courses with the whole of the administration, if you like, provided on the platform. Now, that's only one possible version of it, I'm sure, and it would be right at the beginning of the thinking about platform university. But I suspect it's not the only, but it's one of the major innovations that could be coming to higher education.
So the university in a box type of thing, a bit like banking in a box in the UK, which has been going over the last decade, where they've effectively set up a white label banking platform, and you effectively come along, slap your brand on it, and off you go. Can universities be in a similar context, Liz?
I'm not quite as ambitious as Stephen's vision, because I think there are a couple of things that will moderate how change happens. And part of that is because universities, at least in Australia, are almost all co-funded by the federal government. There is a great deal of government funding that goes into universities, and so they're public institutions. And the important thing about a public institution is that it's the decision about where it is and what it does is not solely driven by market forces. The kind of research that you're talking about, Stephen's very concentrated. It's concentrated in high investment, high value industries, and it's inward. I don't mean inward in its work, but it's closed shop essentially. It owns what it does. Whereas if you look at a public good, that belongs to the country. And Australia, at any rate, this is less true in the US, and the US system's quite different, but in Australia, at any rate, higher education is a public good. It belongs to the public. The other interesting thing here is about distribution. So Australia's got about 40 universities, depending on what you count, and they're distributed across the country, and there's a great deal of loyalty to the local institution. Now, whether that's earned or not, and I know in many cases it really is, we certainly try hard, that local application of both teaching and interaction with industry is important to the communities. So while big strides are made in big investing, big infrastructure places, they trickle down. Oh, that's a dreadful phrase. I wish I hadn't said that. They spread out. They spread out through local interactions, and that mimics how people learn. People learn locally. It's really interesting thinking about the platform university, because if you take the logical extension of the MOOC world, that's what they are. The learner assembles the learning. The learner decides how, when, and what they will learn. And to do that, you need learning skills. You need to understand how you're going to organise your learning and what bits to put together. Now, a lot of it happens by exploration, but people come to institutions because the institutions organise the learning for them. So there's a piece here about learning to learn, where I think there's probably a more conventional role for universities.
But is there then, Liz, and I guess we're seeing it, so we certainly are, there is some sort of a role for someone who, almost like a career navigator or coach, helps people then in a lifelong learning context to start to put it all together for themselves. Because if they are starting really early age, and we'll be talking with Pascal about this after morning tea, if you're starting already in school and you're starting to get micro-credentials and all sorts of things, even potentially becoming qualified as an accountant from, say, year 11, you're going to need some advice and sort of help and services to basically build that lifelong learning experience, or we need to develop our youth to really understand how to manage that, and that's not part of our curriculum at all at the moment.
So I think the trick that we're missing, apart from, I think these ideas are really exciting, but I think the trick that we're missing is joining up the sectors.
Connecting.
So TAFE and further education is quite separated from universities. Victoria has the interesting position of having a number of dual sector institutions. Do to ask Pascal about that.
Absolutely.
Because that seems to me to be the crossover point. If you've got them in the same institution, surely to goodness we can do better work across sectors. But actually they are quite separated. They're separated by regulation, they're separated by history, they're separated by convention, and we need to bring it together because, as you say, David, the real work is in lifelong learning. It's not the first degree, it's the fifth. It's the micro-credential that you picked up to pick up that skill. It's the portfolio that you put together about your experiences off on a tangent from what you're working on at the moment. That is where I see the big change coming, and it will be enabled by a shift in platform. I'm sure that's true.
And technology that sits around it. Yeah, absolutely. Stephen?
Nice socks, David.
Thank you. Do you like them? I've got a scarf that matches as well, by the way, for those at home.
Can I pick up Liz's opening point in that last contribution about universities as public? I entirely agree with that. And when Christopher Pine conspired with a group of 8 to semi-privatise the whole university system, I led the opposition to it. So I take that point. It has its downside in terms of regulation and the potential of stifling innovation, and I suspect we're at that point now. I think some of the big ideas about universities would be really hard now to implement, to get it past the whole complex of the Higher Education Support Act, the ESOS Act, CRICOS. So I think that's a two-edged issue there. But there are other ideas as well around cooperative universities. So I don't know if anyone's heard of Mondragon in the Basque region. It's a cooperative community. They now have Mondragon University, a cooperative university, which is basically owned and run by academics who use technology to the maximum to keep administration down. And I would have thought there's plenty of scope, particularly courtesy of technology and an operating model, for owner-occupied universities to take place, for them actually to be collegiate. Yeah, to be a co-op, cooperative university. So there's more models, more alternative university models than platform or cooperative, and we might talk about the metaversity, harnessing the metaverse in the future. It doesn't
involve Zuckerberg, does it?
But where is the debate happening in Australia at the moment? And even if the debate happens, could it ever be implemented?
But I think there's also some other interesting ones that are coming back. So we're starting to hear about individual academics, and to be honest, it tends to happen more in business disciplines than sort of my neuroscience type background, where they are coming together and they're setting up almost their own education provider in some respects. And I guess one of the more famous ones, certainly in Australia, is Mark Ritson, who's a marketing professor, but also in the US with Scott Galloway, who's got, I think it's Section 4, I think he calls it, which is basically his sort of little online provider that he's got going on there. So there's lots of different models that are starting to come about, aren't they? But to slightly change tack, so yesterday in Melbourne anyway, as many of you know, in August, it's sort of university open day season is pretty much going on at the moment. So yesterday I was out there at Monash Clayton. I hadn't been out there in some time, but my God, the number of buildings that have appeared on that campus is incredible, really, what's happened in such a short period of time. But I was there with my 17-year-old son. I actually had to drag him there because he didn't really want to, but he's in year 11. He's like, why am I going to this thing? Like, everything's pretty much online. Like, even, why are we bothering to go and even talk to all of these people, as he describes them? And I said, well, they're called academics and your father used to be one, but you probably don't remember that. But why are we going out there and talking to them? But anyway, we got out there. We finally, got into the car park, which Monash feels like one ginormous car park sometimes. Got there, parked the car, walk in. There were heaps of people, which was fantastic. Lots of parents there basically badgering academics because their kids aren't actually asking the questions that they need to probably ask, trying to pick up pamphlets and leaflets and all of those sorts of things. But Zach kept saying the same thing. He's very interested in law, so he picked up, effectively all law had was a postcard with a QR code on it, a bit like this. And that was the thing. And he's like, is that it? I've come all of this way, 40 minutes drive in the car to pick up a postcard? Surely that's not what it is. But in his mind, the digital experience, the physical experience, everything else it's just the experience. There is no real difference in it. Are you seeing a similar thing, Liz, in your role? And where's Deakin then going to be able to go with? How do you create that premium digital experience?
So Deakin was established as a distance provider and an on-campus university. So we've always had that idea that your learners aren't necessarily with you in the room. So that, and a series of quite visionary leadership pushed Deakin into a digital world, as I said before, the digital frontier. And that meant that when I got to Deakin in 2016, every class had a video conference in it. There was we're past that now. We've learnt Zoom. We did learn. But the university was hooked up, basically, because the idea was that we would put students who are studying online and studying on campus together. Now, I'll go into why that's not always a good idea in a minute, but it's very interesting watching students coming back onto campus in 2022. So they've been away for 2 years. They're feeling separated. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff out there about Zoom fatigue, about blank screens, about students not connecting with each other, about not feeling ready for work, about not getting practical experience. There's heaps and heaps of information out there. We thought, like all the sector, that when we opened the doors at the start of this year, the students would whoosh back in. Actually, that's not the case. So what's happened is, and I use my library as my barometer because it's the best indicator of people on campus, we're about 60% of the usage that we had in 2019. So the students are coming back, but they haven't come back in full. When we talk to them about it, it's really, really interesting. The students who are coming to university for the first time are learning university. They're more on campus. The students who are coming back after 2 years of online, yeah, they want to be back with their friends. Yes, they want to connect with their teachers. Teachers are important. They want to connect back with their teachers, but it was very convenient being able to pick up extra shifts. It was very convenient to be there when the plumber came. It was very convenient to be able to go and pick up your kids from school. We have a lot of return to study learners. So learners these days don't want a conventional view of education. They want a flexible view of education. But flexibility doesn't mean hands off, no help. It means let's get you started, let's give you the tools to equip you to study on your own, to build your own skills, and then we give you more and more freedom. So why come to campus at all? This is the big question. 2 things. Students do like meeting each other. So if you walk around our libraries now, you can see them sitting together watching lectures on their individual screen. They just like being in this space. And you think, that's weird, they could do that from home and save the commute. But they come in and do it anyway. And of course the other thing is the buildings that you're talking about, David, house a whole lot of infrastructure that students can't get at home. So we had students trying to do dance at home on their own, no studio, no teacher, just a video screen in front of them. We've had kitchen chemistry. Actually, I think every university in Australia has had kitchen chemistry for the last 2 years. There's plenty of stuff that is much better done on a campus. So our approach at Deakin is use the campus for what it's good for. Don't make people come in just because they used to do it in the past. Make it a valuable investment for them to come on. My next big challenge is to get the timetable to do that too, but you know, tomorrow.
That's probably where Google's AI will come in eventually.
Yes, exactly. well, actually, seriously, exactly.
I think that is actually where it's going to be coming in. If anyone's got an idea, that's the place to play, because if you really want to connect the whole thing together and the infrastructure and the facilities and all of that sort of stuff, that's really where it's going to be solved, isn't it, Stephen?
Yeah, David, can I pick up your Monash Open Day comment?
It was a fun experience, though.
I used to be Dean of Law at Monash.
Yes.
And I remember a delegation of professors coming to see me, outraged. There was this young upstart lecturer who'd proposed a new elective unit, and they wanted it nipped in the bud. They didn't even want it to go to curriculum committee. And this new unit was called The Law of the Internet. And it was a horrendous idea that this should ever be taught. Of course, it went through. It was really popular. Students did it. And then the professors came back again and they said, and now they want us to record our lectures. Now, part of their horror was that they had to perform the physical movement of putting a cassette into a machine, and that was pretty scary stuff. But they said, rightly, but if we record our lectures, will anyone come to them? And I said, well, if you add value by being there and getting something going that can't be replicated via a cassette, then yes. But many students, as Liz was saying, fitted it around their lifestyle. They were clerking in a law firm and that kind of thing. And in effect, a hybrid mode emerged, not without some struggle and resistance and so on. So I think there's an organic process underway which is unstoppable, and we'll make some mistakes and we'll reverse direction a bit and so on. But the optimal balance, I think, will emerge.
Yeah, I think it will too.
I'm just going to jump in, David, just very, very quickly. Lecture recording was a blind alley. We shouldn't have done it, and because nobody wants to sit and listen to a recording for an hour. If you actually watch students using them, they watch them on double speed, they watch them in chunks, and it would be much better to design them differently. But sorry.
Yeah, completely agree. I think one of the almost last lectures I gave back in 2010 before I left academia was to an empty lecture theatre where the Echo 360 turned on. 5 past the hour, you just started talking and off you went, and then it finished again at 5 to the hour, and it just recorded the whole thing. And then I walked out and I thought, that's where we're all going, isn't it? So unfortunately, that probably is where it's going. But around technology, though, one area that I think has become partly problematic, and we're not going to mention the 5-letter C word, and pandemics, etc. here today, but one of the things that has been challenging is around assessment. And effectively, we tried, and Curio worked a bit with Sydney Uni on this to try and get them moving into an online proctoring and everything else. And there were so many issues with privacy and everything else around that. But where do we think assessment is then going to go with technology, Liz? Because you've had some interesting experiences there.
Assessment has gone with technology. It's not an option anymore. And I'll tell you the story for Deakin. So in March 2020, like everybody else, 1 week flipped everything online. Now, yes, we had an online presence anyway, so it was familiar territory to the staff, but they still all had to rewrite their curriculum because it was written for on-campus. 1 week. We didn't do a great job. It took some time to catch up. But one of the obvious things that happened was you couldn't do exams on campus. Now, interestingly, for a university that's been digital for some time, Deakin still had a lot of on-campus exams. In 2019, we're in trimesters, at the end of trimester 1, we held 352, I think, on-campus exams. That's traditional exams. Sit down, paper and pen in an exam hall, supervisor watching you, it's all in your head or forget it. So not only did we do that, but because we're a distance provider, we had exam centres across Australia, internationally, all over the joint. Now, if you think about that in terms of what it takes to deliver it, that is a big logistical challenge, and a great deal of money and time went into setting that up every trimester. And I've got some colleagues in the back who know and lived this experience, both as it was and as it will be. So in 2020 we couldn't do that. That was out. So what we did was we wanted something fairly straightforward. So we said, right, for this trimester, and then we'll see how we go, we'll go to open book exams and we'll do them online, and we'll do them with technology that we have in our hands that everybody's familiar with. So we just used the LMS. It wasn't very clever, but it worked. Students were terrified. Staff were very nervous because assessment is very high stakes. Assessment is where the university puts its thumbprint and says that student has achieved what we said they had. And so it's our credential. That credential is actually very important, both to the students and to the university. It's very high stakes. So that was 2020. And then, of course, lockdown after lockdown after lockdown, I won't say the C word, but still, meant we just didn't go back. Now, what was interesting was when we got to 2022 and we could go back, we chose not to. So Deakin now does not have any big exam hall exams. We don't do any exams with paper and pen. What's happened is that 352 exams, first of all, it's shrunk. We've gone to more continuous assessment, so we're down to 250 now. But the second thing that happened is every one of those exams is digital. We did have 4, that's 4 from 350, 4 exams on campus because the accrediting body said, well, we really want a supervisor in the room. But they were still digital exams. The students were doing them on a dedicated platform. Of that 250 exams that were done at the end of T1 this year, the large majority of them were open book online. We ended up using a proctoring service for about 20% of those exams, and we reserve it for those exams where there's an accreditation requirement. It's also been interesting the experience of what the students said. The students were very nervous about assessment online. They thought, oh, it's unfamiliar, I don't know what I'm doing, there's no one there to keep me safe, I'm really scared about this, and most of all, the system's not going to work, it's all going to fall apart, I'm not going to be able to do it. So we put the largest part of our effort into supporting the teachers and the students. We had not 24/7, I don't think it was, I'm looking at the guys up the back, but we had extended hours support for the students so they could test out their stuff and all the rest of it. When we got to this trimester, and we had a student panel last week, the students are now panicking not about being online, definitely not about proctoring, because we kept that to a minute. They're panicking that we might bring them back into an exam hall. And they said, please, don't do that. Of all the things that you're going to do, not put us back in an exam hall. There is never a situation in my working life where I'm going to need the skill of sitting in an exam hall. And we said, yeah, that's right. So now this has brought up a whole lot of new constraints, new problems, new challenges, and I see Phil Dawson's with us, and I'm sure he's going to talk to you about assessment security at some point, and he should. It's a new world and we have to redevelop our approach to assessment, but I would much, much rather be having discussions about the design of assessment, the delivery of assessment, the support of assessment, than having discussions about logistics, and that's where we are.
And you removed being freezing cold in the middle of winter in the exhibition buildings here in Melbourne, which was
we have
awful.
Taken that away, yes.
Really, really awful. We're going to open up for questions. I was just checking on the Slido, just getting my QR codes and everything working, and I haven't seen anything yet. But if you're online and you want to ask a question of the panel through the Slido app, please do so. Otherwise, maybe I'll take something from the floor. Sure. Was that Siri? Siri, do you have a question? Let's have a game, shall we? Hey, Siri. Has anyone got a particular question or a burning question they'd like to add? David's got the roving mic.
There are some questions online.
Oh, there are, and I can't see them.
You didn't see, you did the pretend scan of the QR code. I'll throw a few out there, the ones that have been upvoted. I'll also name and shame those who have put their questions up as well. That's a really fun bit. Jack Goodman, who's the CEO and Executive Chair of Stuosity, asks, I'm curious to know the panel's view of teaching researchers, the teaching versus research nexus. Can universities do both well? Feels like it's a Stephen Parker question to me.
Yeah, it is.
Should we be separating the two, and is tech part of that solution?
Was that Jack Goodman?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Well, I used to believe it. The teaching research nexus. I think now it's a motivating myth. It keeps people going, but I see no real evidence of it being essential. It may be desirable in particular kinds of universities, but I don't see it as essential. It's not even part of a system in some parts of the world. Many of the people that teach students at the moment are not doing research or not in the area that they're teaching students. I think it's a kind of research university motivating myth that's been imposed on us. But what really does matter is learning. And I was going to say this partly in response to what you were saying about assessment. I'm agnostic about modes of assessment as long as people can learn. And we are so unsophisticated in working out learning gain. Learning gain's been described as the dark matter of the sector. You know it's there, you just can't see it. So if someone could work out through analytics, such as Jack Goodman, how actually to measure learning gain and then devise assessment that tests real gain, that I think is the breakthrough. So research on that would be a good idea.
I think it'd be an interesting area of research, definitely. And there's probably the people who are on the science of learning side of things who already started thinking about some of that sort of stuff. If there are others in the room who'd like to speak about, or Liz, any interest?
I concur with Stephen. There's no evidence that I know of that says that a good teacher is a good researcher and vice versa. However, and I think it's a big but, the idea of an ideas ecosystem, which brings those two things together, I think is a very important idea and one that we must promulgate. Getting back to your original question, Stephen, about where universities are going. If they don't put research and teaching together, if they don't inform each other, not necessarily because you give a lecture on your research, but because you show how ideas are generated and how they're translated into industry, and students can walk with you through that journey. If you don't do that, then what is the point of a university?
It's a really good one. There's another one. I think it comes from a Dorothy Dix or a David Linke, but shall we describe it as? So, as HolonIQ tells us, hi HolonIQ folks, education is contracting in total, but digital expenditure is set to grow. What's going on? What's happening with universities in that particular space then?
The world's digital. There's no question that universities must be digital because that's the world we live in. Mind you, the silly thing is that they've been digital for ages. I mean, when was the last time that students actually didn't have an LMS? I mean, that's where the resources come from. When I talk to the library, which I have the great pleasure of having in my portfolio, the vast, and I mean vast majority of information that's sourced from the library is digital. It's people don't go in and pick up books. They do like to be around books, I've got to say, and I'm one of them. But they, rather than look up, they'll download the e-copy because it's easier. So certainly the investment in digital infrastructure is growing, and I would say the other complicating factor here is actually cybersecurity. So that's becoming an increasing area of expenditure as we defend what has been traditionally, conventionally open institutions. And so I concur that the digital expend is likely to grow. Will education shrink? Good question.
Maybe just the education which we put in the tertiary part, which is the sort of 18 to 21, 23-year-old thing, but that's like a
well, it's interesting.
Piece of the puzzle, isn't it?
We've hit the Bradley targets for overall participation, definitely not in particular equity groups. But there are many, many, many countries in the world where they have much higher participation than we do. And the question is, where's the best outcome for the country and the individual? Because it's got to benefit both.
Stephen?
Well, it'll shrink in one sense because the fertility rate in Australia and many similar countries is around about 1.7, needs to be 2.1 to reproduce the population. So we've got a population time bomb ticking at the moment, and it's becoming widely recognised, and the post-pandemic skills shortage has made it painfully obvious. So there will be fewer young people coming through into the education system, but it'll expand in another sense because of the whole lifelong learning thing, that in order to be able to cope in an increasingly technological world with real career changes rather than the much vaunted ones that were supposed to have been happening, people will keep on coming back into education of one kind or another, and presumably digitally enabled. But I actually do think the population time bomb is a serious issue, but for separate exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. But is it therefore going to encourage more upskilling and reskilling of people at different stages of their life, whether they then have kids, for example, and that triggers a reconsideration of their career and what they're doing, or do they hit sort of a mid-50s and go, why have I been doing that for the last 20 years? I'd love to become a school teacher, which is one of my friends who's a partner at a law firm has gone, I've always wanted to be a teacher, and is delightfully in the position where he can self-fund it.
Yeah, it's interesting, David. I think we might think of it as a revolution, but it's already here. 40% of our commencing students and undergraduate degrees are returning to study, 40%. So only 60% of them are coming from school. Now, that differs greatly between universities, but there's no question that upskilling, reskilling, adding to your skills, we think of career starters, career advances and career changes, and they all need different sorts of additional learning, whether it's foundational learning or depth or breadth. And so that it comes back to your point, actually, about curating that, helping learners to decide what they need and when.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess to extend, we've talked a lot about, work skills and professions and what people need for mastery of concepts, etc., to be able to do something. But as Maria was also asked a question around then, but who will teach people how to think?
So this comes to, so this comes
Please.
to this balance between long form and short form learning. Long form learning is the process of developing those longer term translational skills, and there's clearly still an important place for that. I think the question is to help learners to get to that when they're ready to do it. It's interesting when you look at what employers ask for. If you do those skills audits, and there's billions of them out there, that the things that employers ask for are those translational, those long-term, those thinking and being skills so that people can act professionally, adapt and change to the workplace. Employers, I remember doing one work integrated learning project, national project, and our advisory board said, don't worry about the skills. Whatever you teach them, we're going to reteach them anyway. So just don't worry about it. Teach them how to think. Because when you bring them into industry, yes, we want them to understand the foundations, but we'll teach them the particular skills that they need. However, at the same time, people do need to pick up skills. People at that cybersecurity point, lawyers need to understand cybersecurity. So do all sorts of people, social workers. There's lots of people that need that contact with other material. So there are places for short form and long form learning, and I think we need to balance both.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Liv. So our summit theme is Education Unlimited, Think Big, Drive Change, Transform Learning. Stephen, what's the sort of big technology you think that could actually change the university of the future in a few words?
In a few words. I suspect the Metaverse.
That could be a coffee discussion.
It's not my area, but I just finished reading a book by Matthew Ball on the Metaverse, how it revolutionises everything. And there is just so much money at stake in the Metaverse that there's great incentive to conquer it. And Matthew Ball says that whoever gains the real market share in the Metaverse will be the new god on earth, will have more money than any nation state. And I suspect there's something in this. But the idea of presence, which I think is important and which you don't get from looking at a screen, whether it's headset or otherwise, I wouldn't know. But the idea of an enclosed, synchronous, interoperable environment for learning, the Metaversity, as I would call it, I suspect that's a big one.
Yeah, I think that probably is, although I'd need a hell of a lot of Stemetal when I'm wearing those Oculus devices. I don't know about you, but that's certainly how I feel about it. How about yourself, Liz? The one big thing that you think could really change universities is connectors.
I think it's going to come down to learner autonomy. And by that I mean the technology to help people navigate their own path in a structured way and then gradually more and more independently. And that will need a lot of rethinking, not just of the tech, but of how we deploy and organise and package learning so that we support learners who are new and we provide opportunities for those who aren't. One of the things that really I keep coming back to when I think about the revolution of the internet was what it actually did that really impressed me was not that it existed, but that it empowered people to co-create. And that meant that it went in directions that the designers never dreamt of. And that's where I think education should be going.
Technology is the enabler.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for your time this morning. Please thank Liz and Stephen as well.
You guys can exit if you like. Thank you, Steve, Liz and David for an inspiring start to the Melbourne EdTech Summit. I'm certainly lucky to have an office here at Deakin Downtown, so I see the connections across this sector and the great partnership that Deakin have been able to build. So I am very bullish on the idea of the university is a great connector across our society, especially when we start thinking about public good and the sector, EdTech growing from 3.4% to 5.2% of the sector, whilst it's contracting, it sort of indicates something to me. Now, there's still a big step to go, but we're now about to break for morning tea. We are serving morning tea at both ends of the room. If you've got specific dietary requirements, there'll be food down this end for you, but otherwise there's tea, coffee, cakes, sandwiches, anything that you would like. So we're going to begin back here at 11 o'clock, where we're going to start deep diving into how the technology is actually going to impact on student experience. Thanks very much.